the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. I'm glad you could join me today. I'm going to make it worth your while as we talk about how only an extremist would agree with that. I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about things that are considered extreme today that would have been considered, what was that word we used to use not so long ago? Normal. Yeah, there was a time when normal people did normal things like, oh, I don't know, they celebrated freedom, they asserted their pursuit to happiness by building businesses, raising families, and otherwise just doing what they could to make the world a better place. That was before wokeness came upon us. And now we have this great concern over extremism in the political process. Nowhere do we hear about this more than right now in Idaho. And a good example of this was a lot of the concern over the Boise Pride Festival this last weekend, which ended up canceling a kids' drag show because they received so many complaints and expressions of concern, and sponsors withdrawing their sponsorship over the public saying, we're not ready to call that normal. Now, that's fighting words for some people, but I want to share with you a commentary. This is actually from a representative in the state of Idaho. This is Representative Julianne Young, and this was published in idahoednews.org. And what she has to say here is so common sense, but this is going to strike the people on the woke side of the equation as hopelessly extreme. I'm going to share it with you. You tell me if this is extreme. So here are just a few excerpts from her commentary. She says a recent official statement from the Idaho Republican Party objected to the use of taxpayer-funded resources to promote the sexualization of children by adult entertainers in a public park. Now, that statement was, of course, in response to the kids' drag event scheduled as part of a gay pride event in a Boise City park. Now, the statement went on to encourage concerned Idahoans to contact the sponsors of this event, which include publicly funded institutions, and to express disappointment. The statement specifically and repeatedly encouraged citizens to maintain civility in their discussions and to be peaceable in their actions. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. And I think that actually comports with what most of us understood about this. Now, here's what she goes on to say. She says the response from Idaho Democrats, from the media, and from many of these big corporations has been astonishing and disappointing. Regardless of what one believes about various lifestyles, the sexualization of children has historically been completely unacceptable. Yet the Idaho Joint Democratic Caucus released a statement of their own characterizing Republican concerns about sexualizing children as, look at these words they use, false, dangerous claims that stoke violence and as bullying tactics by extremists that constitute an attack. Seems like we heard a lot of this, especially from the media, which was trying so hard to conjure up some way to make this sound, oh, it's legit, it's respectable. How could anybody have a problem with it? And yet the more they explained, the deeper they dug the hole. Going back to this representative's comments, she says, in a similar vein, prominent newspaper editors responded to the Republican statement by completely ignoring the concerns about sexualizing children, and instead of addressing the substance of the statement, they launched into character attacks and straw man arguments. And it's true, that's exactly what they did. It was all about the reaction, nobody talking about, well, what about the idea of putting kids into such a hypersexualized kind of event? Even prominent corporate sponsors of the gay pride event responded by characterizing Republican concerns as extremist. It's almost like extremist is a new cuss word that is used to explain anything that we don't like. This representative says sexualizing children is unacceptable regardless of who is doing it. The fact that the kids' event was canceled in response to public pressure is hardly reassuring. They recognized the error of what they were promoting here. And she says the fact that the organizers involved minors in the first place remains a problem. And the fact that anyone would defend these actions, discount concerns, or respond by attacking those raising them is disturbing. And she says it's not lost on me that the measured Republican statement urging civil disagreement has been met by bombastic rhetoric attacking and condemning those seeking to protect Idaho children. She says, I hope Idahoans are taking note of the fact that those who purport to be champions of tolerance and diversity have zero tolerance, respect, or civility to extend to those who disagree with them. And she's right. By far the most intolerant behavior we've seen was on the part of people defending this drag queen or this drag show for kids. She says the middle ground in the conversation around sexuality and children is evaporating. A movement that targets children with drag queen story hours and back-to-school drag shows and places them on stages as performers in sexually themed events cannot hide behind the empty defense that this is just about the private decisions of mature adults. And she's right. This goes far beyond, we just want to be left alone. We just want to have the same things that everybody else has. This is about, we want to normalize and bring this into the mainstream, starting with the kids. And I'm not going to hesitate to use the phrase, this is about twisting minds at as early an age as possible so that you can take advantage of having taught them early on to be desensitized to this kind of thing, to see it as normal. She says, regardless of what anyone may claim about these events, the picture of the young person shown on the volunteer page of the recent Boise drag event sucking on a large genital-shaped rainbow-colored popsicle says it all. When tolerance becomes an excuse for sexual exploitation, our duty to succeeding generations demands that responsible corporations and citizens draw a line in the sand. Now, I understand there are people who are going to say, well, gee, that sounds so very violent, but does it really? I mean, where is the call to violence? I noticed in there are a couple of places she's pointed out, we've specifically encouraged people, be civil in registering your disapproval, but also be vocal in registering your disapproval. Look, there's no way that is going to please everybody. There's no way that a person can say, I don't agree with this without someone going, well, that just, gets my feathers ruffled. That's life. And as long as a person's behavior is peaceful, registering their disapproval is not an attack. But you look at some of the rhetoric that's being used, especially calling people extremists, and we're going to talk more about that here in just a few moments. And it seems very clear that the deck is being stacked against anyone who is willing to assert, first of all, their personal freedoms and their personal or their natural rights, which, by the way, are what limit government power over us. But you're also going to see them being pilloried for disagreeing with whatever the latest trendy moral imperative is, courtesy of wokeism. Oh, and by the way, the idea that, there was nothing sexual about this and we weren't putting these kids into a sexualized situation, please. This is an actual screenshot from the Boise Pride Festival's website. I should say it was, because they have since changed the picture. Apparently, you can see the kids standing there. Oh, look, they're having fun. They've got the rainbow stuff, and you get a little bit of a close-up there, and you can see, yeah, this is not exactly as innocent as it's being portrayed. So if you want to try and tell me this is not about any kind of a sexualized environment, yeah, take a good look at that picture on the right and try harder. See if you can come up with something a little more plausible. The fact of the matter is, it was a very sexualized event. And while people may take their kids to pride festivals and people may want to, take them to parades and whatnot, as parents deem what's appropriate for their kids or not, that's their choice to make. But don't be surprised if someone says, you know what, I disagree with this. And there were apparently plenty of people who registered that disapproval peacefully, but they did show up and they protested. But what's so interesting is the accusations, well, just by protesting, you're inviting violence. Not so. This is just one of those unfortunate times where a small but very vocal group, a very loud group, has decided to defy reality and to, push the boundaries of what's normal and what's acceptable. And they encountered that terrible word that, 2-year-olds hate to hear, no. They don't want to be told no. They don't want to be told that people are not going to be on board with this. And I get that you might be disappointed that, well, this is something the public's just not ready for. But you have to remember, too, that the standards of decency are not something that just evolved, since President Trump was elected in 2016. These are things that billions of minds have worked on for thousands of years. And you know what? People have made mistakes from time to time, but oftentimes when there is a boundary set or where there's some kind of a limit as to what is acceptable behavior, there's usually a pretty good reason behind that. And it's something based on having observed human nature, again, over thousands of years and through trial and error, trying to figure out what works. So I thought it was a very solid explanation on the part of this representative. I applaud her for sticking her neck out. She will take heat. She will take real vitriol for simply pointing out that sometimes adults have to stand up and put their foot down and say, this is not going to do. This is not going to fly. Now, let's talk a little bit about why is it so important that anybody who is not in lockstep with the people already in power, be they Republican or be they Democratic, why is it so essential that we paint them as extremists? And to better answer that question, I want to share with you a few excerpts from our good friend Jim Jones. Jim has weighed in an op-ed that was republished in idahopress.com. Alaska has shown how to achieve sensible election reform. Oh, well, do tell, Jim, what exactly could that possibly mean? Jim Jones says that Idaho had an open primary system prior to 2012. When the primary election rolled around, voters would request a ballot for the party of their choice, Republican, Democrat, whatever, and then vote among the candidates on that ballot. And it worked well, but not to the satisfaction of what he calls right-wing or radical right-wing Republicans who wanted to tip the balance in favor of what, again, he calls ultra-conservative candidates. Jim, it would be helpful if you could give us a little bit of context as to what you mean. Otherwise, you sound like a little schoolboy just shouting names at people out on the schoolyard. What exactly do you mean by radical right-wing? Quantify what that means. Tell me what you mean by ultra-conservative candidates. Maybe contrast that with what you would consider a non-ultra-conservative or acceptable candidate. I have a feeling that this really comes down to he has a preferred flavor of statism that he wants, and anybody who doesn't prefer that flavor is somehow considered the enemy. Now, Jim Jones says the GOP managed to close its primary to all but declared Republicans in 2012. Listen to this, for the sole purpose of purging more moderate, pragmatic candidates from its ranks. And that's exactly what happened. Since Idaho is one of the reddest states in the country, he says the winner of the Republican primary is usually the person who will prevail in the general election. Extremists, according to Jim Jones, just have to marshal their forces in the primary to elect those who represent what he calls their distorted views. Jim Jones says that Alaska has just demonstrated how Idahoans can achieve sensible reform of our electoral system. In 2020, Alaska voters approved an initiative in establishing a ranked choice voting system. Now, this provides for all candidates, regardless of party, to participate on a single primary ballot. The top 4 vote getters move to the general election ballot for ranked choice selection. So the voters merely rate the candidates as their first, second, third, and fourth choice. If no candidate receives more than 50% of the first choice votes, the candidate with the fewest first choice votes is eliminated, and the voters who put that candidate at the top of their list have their votes reallocated to their second choice candidate, and so on till one candidate gets more than 50% of the vote. Now, there's one more thought that he adds here, and that is several what he calls nonpartisan groups, and I'm going to assume these are groups that agree with Jim Jones, have expressed interest in pursuing an initiative in Idaho to establish a ranked choice system like Alaska's. I think he's particularly happy because he's apparently not down with now I forget her name, former governor Sarah Palin. Thank you. He's not down with Sarah Palin. She lost because of ranked choice voting, and he's saying, well, then this must be the right tonic to cure the extreme partisanship that has taken root in Idaho during the last decade. It would allow candidates to focus on real problems confronting the gem state rather than the manufactured cultural issues that are designed to tear us apart solely to achieve political power in the closed GOP primary. It would bring more voters into the primary election and give them a better idea of where the candidates stand on the real issues. And again, Jim, tell us what those real issues are, because I have a feeling that your thinking is a little bit skewed here. And I'm not telling you that you're a bad guy. I'm just saying that if you think that there's extreme partisanship that has taken place in Idaho in the last decade, can I suggest that perhaps some of that extreme partisanship, as you call it, is actually the product of government moving extremely far beyond its legitimate barriers and its boundaries? And it's not the people who love freedom. It's not your rank and file Republicans that are pushing that. It's usually rhinos, or let's see, what would you call them? I know he had another name for it. Oh, the nonpartisan groups. Yes, the people who agree with me, the people who believe statism is the cure because anything that's not under the control of the state is by definition out of control. What he's talking about here is basically making it easier to fool the masses. Now, look, I consider myself kind of a political agnostic. I don't like politics, simply because to me, this is Bronze Age technology. What it really comes down to, every single political contest is still about which way are the spears going to point once all the votes have been counted. Are they going to point at them or are they going to point at us? And that's how a lot of people have started to approach voting. It's not about, well, what am I doing to elect someone who will represent me and will absolutely uphold the values or uphold the principles of good government, as I understand it. It's more about, I need somebody who will punish those who disagree with me before they can punish me if they get power. Does that not describe pretty much what every election has been like for the last, well, actually for the last couple of decades? But it's getting worse. It's getting much, much worse. And if you think about it, the whole ranked choice voting or the open primary thing, I mean, it couldn't be that the Republicans in Idaho have chosen to go with a closed primary route because someone, just, some enterprising soul discovered, hey, if we can get enough people who aren't really Republicans, but who will register as Republicans to go in there and monkey wrench this election by voting for whatever candidate, particularly if there's a Republican candidate that actually scares those who want to maintain the status quo, then we're going to try and get as many people as possible to come into the primary and vote for one of their opponents. Anything to keep them from making it through the primary and onto the fall election ballot. Okay, that's not honest. So to pretend that, well, if we just do it like it's open, everybody can come in and it just works better this way. I think California saw this a few years ago when Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor of California. And I know there were some people who thought, well, that's the pinnacle of amazing. Look at this guy, this movie star, he became the governor. But if you remember in that election, certainly it's a popularity contest. And as far as name recognition, I think he'd been a pretty tough one to beat. For crying out loud, porn star, what's her name, Mary Carey, ran in the open primary. I mean, it brought the kooks out of the woodwork. Now, parties exist for the purpose of getting candidates elected, and I understand that. So if the Republican Party in Idaho or any other state decides, but this is how we want to protect the process to make sure people aren't monkey wrenching our system and gaming it for their own political goals, we want to make sure that the people who are actually signing up to vote Republican are Republican. That's their choice. They're a private organization, right? They're not part of the state government. There may be some government oversight as far as elections go, but the parties themselves are private entities. This just seems to me like a good way to try to blunt the impact of the voters by watering it down, by bringing as many I'm trying to think of the right word for this. As many voters who are firm in their character and not just flexible in their ethics. Oh, okay, well, I'm going to pretend to be a Republican, but I'm really going to just do this and then go vote Democrat in the general election. So I'm okay with the idea of let's limit the possibilities for mischief, but let's also keep in mind too, it's a lot easier to fool masses of people. The M in masses is silent most of the time. This is why you're going to see there's principled opposition to the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Why? Because it took the election of senators to the federal Senate away from state legislatures, and it put it in the hands of the people. Now, some people play it, oh, well, that's a great thing. The people have a voice. But you don't understand the genius of the founders. The House of Representatives, that's a place where the people elect their representatives every 2 years. The Senate was supposed to be elected under a different circumstance. They were supposed to be appointed by state legislatures or legislators, and their job was to represent the state's interest in Congress. So when the 17th Amendment was ratified, all it did was it shifted the loyalty and the attention of those senators from the people of the states that they were representing to once they get to that level, it's just a matter of enough ads out there with enough name recognition or generating enough fear against it. It's really easy to fool the masses. This is one of why I think the caucus convention system, no, it's a little microcosm of representative government, which is what we live under. We're not a democracy. We are a representative republic. Sometimes that's easy to forget. But when you hear people talking about how anybody who's not with us and not with the way that we want to do things, meaning the status quo, is somehow an extremist, they are setting the stage for some very dangerous events down the road. How dangerous? Well, let's just say that we've seen what happens when leftist intellectuals get control of real power, like get control of the apparatus of the state. And I don't care if they have the Republican moniker behind their name or something else, but there's a lot of leftist power mongering going on right now. And if they get power, they have a tendency to want to overturn the very basis of civilization. You think about the Jacobins in revolutionary France, the Bolsheviks in Russia, the Nazis in Germany, the Maoists during China's Great Cultural Revolution, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Now, granted, these are all very scary regimes that I'm talking about here. And I know that we, console ourselves saying, well, that's never going to happen here. But the truth is it could happen anywhere where the conditions are right. And even more alarming, it seems to be happening right now in the U.S. and other Western countries. And the danger here is that when you have people who are actively labeling half the country as extremists because they're not on board with whatever these leftist goals are, you have people who are trying to set up a system by which those people who are not on board and who cannot be counted as the party faithful can be marginalized, forced to the edges of society, and at some point, we can assume, dealt with. I don't even know what that means, but that's the kind of language you hear from people like Justin Trudeau in Canada. People who won't get the vaccine are extremists, and we need to deal with them somehow. Yeah, there have been other people who've tried to deal with undesirables or deplorables throughout history, too. We have a name for what they do. I think it's called genocide. Democide actually is probably a better explanation because it's just people killed by their governments. There's a reason why government power has to remain limited. And when government gets off its leash, it makes things very dangerous. And I think probably the worst part of all is just this distorted one-dimensional caricature that emerges of, well, this must be what those people who won't go along with the program are like. So here you have it. Here's the archetypical extremist. Look at him sitting there waving his Gadsden flag, posting Pepe memes, wearing his tinfoil hat to protect his thoughts. Oh, he's got his QAnon armband on there, surrounded by guns and looks like empty pizza boxes and Starbucks cups, most likely in mom's basement because we know this guy's nothing but a big loser out there creating hate online on his laptop, talking with all of his stupid friends about stupid things that nobody cares about and nobody agrees with. That's us. That is how you and I are seen by people like Jim Jones, by members of the media. Now, look, we understand that they are wrong, and it may seem hurtful to be portrayed in such terms. It doesn't make me happy, but at the same time, I understand they're not seeing reality, and I don't know, what it would take to convince them that this is a really dangerous path that we're headed down. I do know this. If you are determined to stand up for freedom of conscience, individual liberty, private property rights, limited government, if any of these things matter, free speech, right? If you are willing to stand up for these things, we are in a time and place where you can be expected to suffer for your beliefs. I'm sorry. I wish it wasn't that case. I wish that it didn't hurt to do it, but it does. And so you and I have got to become okay with being misunderstood, misrepresented, called names, and maligned, and called, all kinds of horrible things that could eventually even lead to some people calling for us being rounded up, put in camps, whatever it may be. I mean, they don't understand. It may not be that history repeats itself, but it certainly rhymes. And we're definitely in one of those rhyming phases right now. You and I cannot afford to leave the moral high ground, though. That means whatever methods we use, whatever we do to try to promote truth, whatever we do to try to promote freedom, to try to promote good candidates who understand what the proper, legitimate role of government is, we've got to be above board in everything that we're doing. We've got to use the highest possible ethics, because in our case, the ends, we can't just say the ends justify the means. The means by which we promote and perpetuate freedom matter more than you know. Now, again, I wish that it wasn't the case that I'm telling you, hey, by the way, you're going to have to suffer if you really are a freedom-minded person. But I think we're grown-ups here and we can accept that fact. We're not the first people in history who've had to do this. In fact, we're going to find ourselves in pretty good company with others historically who have faced this decision and had to stand up. Now, the good news is you don't need a clear majority of people in order to make a difference or even to hold the line. But you need people who really understand and have moral clarity about what's right and what's wrong and won't be moved or swayed by a bunch of angry demands or name-calling or finger-pointing or other hysteria on the part of those people who are seeing through enemy-driven thinking. And that's what's driving so much of this discourse. I know that, I'm calling out Jim Jones here. Jim, I don't know that you're a bad guy. I'm going to assume that you're probably a pretty decent person. You've served your country, you've served your state, you've done a lot of things to try to help in your own way. But I got to tell you, the way that you apply the label extremist to anyone who isn't in lockstep with you, to me, makes you a very dangerous man, and not the kind of person that I would want to keep company with, because I think that you're being misled, and worst of all, I think people are looking to your example and being misled because of what you're saying. Maybe it's time to drop your defenses a little bit, come talk to people who think a little bit differently, and see if there's some common ground. Because otherwise, you're going to find you have more in common with those French Jacobins than you have with anybody resembling, defenders of freedom or the American way. Maybe that doesn't matter. But again, for those of us who favor freedom, it does matter, and how we approach it will make all the difference. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.